Hello, this is Gecko Mayhem. This is my second developer video log, devlog. In the first one, I went over how I started using Unity, learning how to use it. It was called the Unity Essentials Project. I learned all sorts of things, very little of which was understanding how coding works, writing scripts, and things like that. I was basically plonking objects into the game environment and making them do stuff. And although I did build a block tower, make a ball knock the blocks over, and I made a car jump and collect stars and a little puff of dust, a lot of that was just fundamental stuff. It was the basics of how to use Unity as opposed to how to build a game in Unity, and I familiarized myself with it, and it was good. The next step on my game development journey is to learn how to code in C# and how that integrates with Unity itself. So I'm going through the Junior Programmer Essentials thing, I guess. It is basically an introduction to C#, and it also steps me through how to use Unity a bit more and how to put things in and how to use things. And the fundamentals that I learned in the Unity Essentials project, I am actually able to apply, to revisit, and to expand upon in this. And so in this second video, I feel like I'm ready to make a game. No, not really. I have learned quite a lot. This first project or prototype, as it may be, also has a lot of pre-built assets, but all of the coding I had to learn and implement myself. And near the end of it, I was doing my best to just absorb from the video content and apply it without referring to anything. And I was pretty successful, I have to say. So I'm just going to step through what I did and what this part of the learning experience was, and that'll basically be what this video is about as step 2 on my journey, which is still the very beginning, but I'm starting to grasp some concepts, especially around what I've learned with regard to C# scripting. So first things first, I'm actually going to turn off my webcam so that I can kind of concentrate on the settings, Unity itself, and also Visual Studio. So I was given a pre-built scene, an environment, and in this environment there was a road, there were mountains, there was a skybox with a built-in sky and stuff, and I was given in the course library obstacles to choose from and vehicles to choose from. So I chose a random car, whichever car it was, and I believe there is a way to view the model before you plonk it into the game view. So this was the car I chose here. I can select it, I can focus on it, I can look at it from a top-down view, for example, I can look at it from the back, I can look at it from the side, and I can rotate my camera around. I'll just shift up a bit like that, and I can look around the car, essentially. So I dropped this car into the game world, and it was just a car. And I dropped some cones in. I duplicated the cones, boom, 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 spaced them basically equally along this road, and that was the start. And then I had to make everything start to work together. And so in programming something, what I learned is you check things in Unity, for example, the position of where something actually sits, or the rotation of it, or the scale of it, and then you can put that into your code and refer to it. So in order to make the car go forward, I had to learn what is it that causes something to move. And every game object has a position, according to this transform part of the inspector window. And if I want to shift that position, then I need to refer to this transform area and I need to make the car move by using a command called translate, which changes its position. If I use the command position, it will tell me where that object actually is. It won't move it. So I need to tell it a new position using the translate command to make it move to a new position. And as I very briefly mentioned in my first video, I learned that there are two things within the code, which I'll bring up now. And I'll actually open the PlayerController code, which is the one that I had to write for the car, because the car is the player, essentially, in air quotes, player. And that's the object that's going to move. And the first step was just to make it move, just to make it go forward. Just say, car, go forward, basically. And it shot off the screen really fast because you tell it to move, but everything is updated once per frame. So the default when you get a new script is you get this PlayerController. You get the name of the script, mono behavior, which determines the behavior of what you're programming in. And there were these two parts, void start, which is called immediately when the game starts, and void update, which is every frame. It says update is called once per frame. So everything you put into void update is called once per frame. And if you're running at, say, 120 frames per second, that's 120 instructions every second. And so if you set, for example, the speed of the car at 15, that would be 15 units per frame, which would be 15 times the frames per second, 120, which is what? More than 1,500 meters per second, which is absolutely insane. And so the car just shot off into the distance. And so I had to learn that, so the first step was just setting the speed of the car. And I had to learn, before I put all this other stuff in, that to move it forward, I would do transform.translate vector3 because it's a three-dimensional object, dot forward, which is a really cool command. It just moves it forward along the z-axis, and the z-axis? I think it is the z-axis, back and forth. And this really fantastic, useful command, time.delta-time, which I will probably never forget, which makes it update every second as opposed to every frame. So you're actually setting something to units per second. So no matter what your frame rate is, it's still going to function the same. It's still going to move the same amount. And then speed is this variable up here. So the speed, which I could change, I made it a private function, private variable, sorry, which means you cannot see it in the Unity inspector window. If it says public, which I learned, you can see it in the inspector window in Unity, and you can change the numbers. So if I just change that to public, I'd be able to change the speed in Unity. Whereas when I'd finished my code, I changed them all to private, so you can't change it in Unity. You have to come back into the script and set your integer here. Floating integer. So I set the speed of the vehicle, I did time.delta-time times speed, and it was cool. The car moved at 15 meters per second, which is not that fast. It's just driving forward. Like, I'm not exactly sure what that is. It feels like about 20 or 30 kilometers an hour, maybe, give or take. It could be slower than that. So the car's moving forward, great. But I want a bit of control, so I had to learn about this thing called the input manager, and it's kind of cool. So if I just flip off Visual Studio, actually, I think Visual Studio was actually not showing me the code just then. There it is. There's the code. Okay. So there's the speed up the top. There's my code to make the vehicle move forward. and I had to learn about the input manager. So if I go back to Unity, and now I can't even remember where the input manager is. It's basically built into Unity, where keyboard and mouse and gamepad inputs are defaulted to certain keys and buttons, and the manager manages the input. So it integrates well with a script, because I could look up, what is this thing going forward or going sideways, the x-axis and the z-axis, and what are the defaults for that? And so I found out that the area where you move forward is called vertical, and so I added this code here. The forward input is input.getAxis, so which axis is it along, and it's along the vertical axis. And then when I wanted to make the car start to turn left and right, first of all I had to add horizontal input, which is along the x-axis, and that's called horizontal. And so that was pretty easy. So I had to learn to turn the car, so it became transform.rotate vector 3 again, which is a three-dimensional object, .up, which is the direction that you want it to rotate, and then time.delta time again, and then turn speed. So that's how fast does your car or your game object rotate on its axis, and I set that up the top here to 45. I figured that was a good turn speed for a car, and then times this one called horizontal input, which I did as a key input. And so if I use, within the input manager, it has the arrow keys, but it also has the WASD keys. So there's primary and secondary keys that are by default the ones that you use. And so when I drive the car, if I go back to Unity, if I play it, the car drives along the road and I can turn it. Now 45 doesn't seem like a very fast turny thing, so I actually am using the input of WASD. So W to go forwards, A and D to turn left and right, and then S is backwards. So if I go back into the code, it's very basic. I can't see where I'm going now because the camera doesn't go to the back of the car. But yeah, just a simple start. Hit these cones and it knocks them over. There is collision with the cones, and I set some parameters around the cones. They're fairly light compared to the weight of the car. And if I go back into my Visual Studio script, if I were to change the turn speed of the car, let's say I change it, even though it's a floating integer, I can just put a whole number in and it will interpret that as an integer, as a floating integer still. So if I change that to say 75 and go back to my game, and then hopefully that saved it. 75, okay, and then it has to compile it for a second, and then I can go back into the game. Now my turn speed is a lot faster. So 75 lets me turn it and control it a fair bit more than 45. So that's how easy it is to, drive around, hit the cones, avoid the cones. So simple maneuvering, creating a player object and giving it some functionality just through user input. Now, part of the learning was not to change the camera so it's always behind the car. And I'm going to show that now. I actually learned to write a script for the camera, and I called this script FollowPlayer, this one down here, FollowPlayer. And it basically allows you to connect a game object to another object. The FollowPlayer has a little field here called player that I added to the script, and I just tossed the vehicle in there. And so it's saying I want the camera attached to this game object, which is vehicle, which is this. So it's attached to it, but it's a fixed camera. I was not taught how to make the camera stay behind the car and follow along behind the car. So when the car turns, the camera turns. That was not part of it. Okay, so the last thing is to have a look at this FollowPlayer script. Basically, what it does is it uses transform.position. So what I was talking about just earlier is the position of any game object. And it equals the player's position. So it's getting the player's position. And I add an offset, which is where the camera sits. As a variable, I can change it up the top here, offset, and it tells me where the camera sits. Now, I'd already moved the camera to behind the car, and it was at 0x 5y minus 7z. So that means that it was just back from the car and up above it. And so I looked at those coordinates where the camera had been sitting when I was doing everything, and then I just put them in here as the offset for the camera for when that camera is attached to the vehicle as a game object. And so I add that, the offset of the camera sitting back behind the car, according to where the player is, and then that is where the camera will always be as it updates, because it's called every frame that it updates that the camera is always sitting behind the car. And I changed it from update to late update, which means that the camera which I'm attaching to the vehicle is always updated last. I hope that made sense. It made sense to me because I learned about it. And it's been a week or so since I worked on this particular prototype, plus its challenge, which I'm going to go over very quickly before the end of this video. But yeah, basically that is what I did, is made the car move, gave the player control over the car, gave the cones collision, and set the camera to sit always behind or facing that particular direction. Now I could go into it a bit more and figure out, well, how do I make the camera change so that when you turn the car, the camera changes and turns with the car? But that was not actually part of the learning, and possibly too complicated. I wonder why they didn't have me do that and learn about that, but I think that's beside the point now. It is what it is. I can control the car. So the next thing after this was to work on a challenge, and I installed these challenge files. And so the next scene was an aeroplane, and there were also scripts similar to the scripts that I had created for the car, which is the camera following the player, FollowPlayer, PlayerController, you control the plane. And then I added a bonus one of spinning the propeller. I had to learn how to make the propeller part of the plane spin constantly, have a rotation. And that took a little bit to figure out, but it was really good. It was challenging to figure something out myself. Now, the scripts existed for FollowPlayer and PlayerController, but they were buggy, deliberately buggy. So this was the challenge. The challenge was figure out what in the scripts is wrong, fix them, test them, and make the plane fly under the player's control so that you control whether the plane flies up or down, and you have the camera following it from side on. So what that looks like is this. So the plane is flying with the spinning propeller. I can make it dip down, I can make it dip up, and fly through these obstacles, which is cool. One of the funky things I found is if you hit the walls, it actually makes the plane, let's just hit a wall, it makes the plane kind of start spinning by itself without, I'm not touching the keys now, but the plane is slowly rotating by itself. And if I bang into the wall a bit more, it just keeps rotating by itself. I don't know what causes this. It's something to do with the physics. Let's See, it's slowly tilting itself. And can go, but I fixed it so that I can control whether the plane does loops and which way it goes. So I can fly it upside down through the gaps. And I'm going to look at those scripts now very quickly, just before I end the video. So I'm going to go into Visual Studio and I'm going to open the PlayerController script. So I took what I'd learned from the car. I set a speed and I set a rotation speed. So the speed that the plane flies at, which is 5 meters a second, the rotation speed. And I had to set an input, so vertical input again. Allows me to move it up and down. I set the speed of the plane, exactly the same as with the car, where it's transform.translate, vector3.forward, because it's moving forward, time.delta time makes it per second, times speed, which is this one up here, where I can change it. These are still public variables, by the way. I can change those in Unity. And then in terms of being able to control the tilt of the plane going up and down, I did the same as the car turning left and right, except I did it vector3.right, rotation speed, delta time, and vertical input. So the vertical input is a public amount. It was kept public so I could see that it was actually happening when I press those arrow keys. So when I press them, it goes to 1 or -1. So pressing up will go to +1, and pressing down will go to -1, or vice versa, because it's a plane, so things are reversed. But either way, I took what I'd learned, so I gave it input, I gave it a forward speed, and I gave it a rotation speed under control of the player. So the rotation is like the car, going left and right, under control of the player to go up and down. And the propeller is the last thing that I had to figure out and work on, which was not super hard. So I want the propeller to have a rotation speed. So I called it rotation speed. And then it's a new vector. So it's basically telling it to change when I do the rotation down here, I want it to be a new vector. So under the transform part of Unity, everything has a rotation, and that's here. So you've got an X rotation, a Y rotation, a Z rotation, and you can actually check the rotation of stuff by, so that's the propeller, bringing up the rotation thing. And if I rotate it manually, you can see over on the rotation thing over here that the Z, it's the Z that makes it spin this way. And so when I went back into the code, this is the Z axis. So I don't change the X axis, I don't change the Y axis, I want to change the Z axis every update. So I want it to be every second, so I use time.delta time instead of every frame, so that it's actually a constant according to how the plane is flying as well. And then I set the rotation speed as a new Z positioning rotation. So the Z axis is shifting 900 per second, which means the propeller is spinning like a propeller should. It took me a little while. You just experiment with speeds. So along the Z axis, the propeller is spinning. Public. So what happens is, changing to a public variable, under the SpinPropeller script, I should now have rotation speed here, and I can change the Z. So if I just play it, Let's just get the plane somewhere so that it's flying a bit. And if I change the rotation speed, the propeller spins faster and faster until it's spinning very fast. And then I can slow it down again by changing the Z rotation, and it slows right down. And then I can spin it and speed it up again. Over 1100 now. There we go. We just about flew completely out of the game environment. Actually, 1100 looks pretty good. But yeah, that's basically what I learned, is how to control a player object, and learning about translation, which is movement, and about positioning and rotation. And that's what I've learned so far, and I will be able to apply what I learned, even though I didn't create any of the game assets. I'll be able to apply it to whatever project I work on in terms of a game idea and developing a minimum viable product. Thank you for watching.